Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Brenner. Can everyone hear me? Is my microphone working? Well, it is just a delight. What a treat you have in this session to go into a London that many of you can't even imagine exists. I was telling Ben earlier that I have been listening to his book on Audible in all of my rounds walking through London and just trying to put the scenes to what he's written, and it's an extraordinary book. Ben, who has written a marvelous book about Russia called The Fragile Economy, has been at Politico. He is a writer whose byline you know well. But Ben, you have become a kind of bizarre George Orwell of this strange Brexit global moment.
That's much too kind. Much too kind.
So, Ben, let's just plunge right into the process of how this begins for you. You come back from London, and you come back from Russia, and your first impression of London is what?
So I began my career as a foreign correspondent, and after university, I went to work in Russia and in the former Soviet states, and I was crisscrossing Russia's kind of vast expanse, interviewing sort of nationalist guerrillas, provincial governors, and the occasional saintly figure. And I realized as I was working in this way that the foreign correspondent is a way of writing. It's a way of writing in which you give voice about the most important political issues of the time to those in the periphery, to the poor, to those left out of the conversation. It's a way of writing that puts reporting first and triple underscores that. And when I came back to be full-time in London, having finished my first book, I realized I didn't quite recognize London. Maybe it's because I'd never really paid much attention to it when I was growing up. I've been growing up in my own bubbles, both sort of culturally and linguistically, and then gone off to university. And I wanted to kind of read about it and find out what was this sort of change that was happening. But in most of the British newspapers, the dominant forms there to write about modern Britain were the big set-piece political interview, which doesn't really tell us very much about society, very, very number-heavy, fact-heavy, sort of statistical-heavy journalism, which again didn't have very many human stories, or then the columnists, these grand pontificators. And I was reading this and I felt, I just don't trust these ways of writing to answer my questions of like, what is London? So I decided to write the book that I wanted to read, a book that would not be an analysis book, a book that would not be a statistics book, a book that would not be a book of opinion. In fact, it would have no opinions of my own in it. And I would try as much as possible to do a work of sort of pure reporting about this city.
So let's plunge right into your process. I was so intrigued that you start your book in Victoria Station, and I'm going to ask you to read just a sort of scene setting, just short 2 paragraphs from the opening pages. Here is Ben Judah, age 26, at Victoria Station.
Oh, thank you. Well, so one of the things about talking about your book long after the event is you feel like you are employed by your previous self. And so this is very much how I feel today. I'm standing in the damp again, keying in what I can see, because I only trust what I can see. I was born in London, but I no longer recognise the city. I don't know if I love the new London or if it frightens me, a city where at least 55% of people are not ethnically white British, nearly 40% were born abroad, and 5% are living illegally in the shadows. I have little idea who these new Londoners are or what their London really is. This is why I keep coming here. So why did I keep going to Victoria Coach Station? I've got a very strong sense that the official geography of London is very much trapped in old myth. It's trapped in period drama. It's trapped in a sort of upper middle class sense of where the city is. And the most important psychological points in the city are often neglected. And one is Victoria Coach Station, which is where all of these buses, all of these Euro lines are coming in from Eastern Europe every day. And in a way, I felt that this is the sort of Ellis Island of our day for the great migration that's come from the new member states of the European Union. I'd never seen it written about, and let alone seen people collect a lot of stories from there. And I felt incredibly drawn to this place to capture this moment, that feeling of what it was like to be there.
And then there's these extraordinary statistics. What is it? Is it 2,000 people, immigrants a day, are coming in through Victoria Station?
Well, yes, that was at the time. I haven't subsequently followed that up with a freedom of information request, but that was at the time, yes.
And in Victoria Station, so just let's back up for a moment to tell the backstory of why you are uniquely suited to interview and to find these untold stories. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Romania.
Oh, well, I don't know if I'm sort of uniquely suited, but thank you very much. Well, I come myself from an immigrant background. Like, my father's family are originally actually Jews from the city of Calcutta, from the Jewish community of it's called the Baghdadi Jewish community of Calcutta and Bombay, and the Judah family lived actually for many centuries happily in Calcutta, and only finally came to settle in the UK in the sort of 1950s. So I grew up, and in fact, in my parents' house, I still am about, with bits of India all over the house, from chests from the China trade to kind of old sort of vintage documents to all kinds of little objects from their life. And listening to my grandparents, it made me fascinated about immigrant storytelling. It made me think it's very important. It's a particular way of transmitting identity and belonging, and storytelling for the immigrant and for the immigrant family replaces the village or the relationship with a sense of space or place that's been lost by travelling overseas. So it made me always very interested growing up to know what other people's immigrant stories were. So my father's a journalist, and when I was young, we lived in Eastern Europe. So I lived in Romania, and I lived in Belgrade, then in the former Yugoslavia, now in Serbia. And then I went to a French school, and afterwards I went on to study Russian. So that whole process made me a sort of, amongst many other things, like an enthusiast for languages. So I've got a kind of good grasp of French, Russian, Romanian, and Hebrew.
So right off the bat, as we say, you are able to try out your Romanian at Victoria Station, which leads you to extraordinary scene number 1 in Park Lane. Can you plunge us into that world?
Sure. Well, Romanian is actually a fascinating language, just to bear with me for the digression, because it's like a combination of Latin and Slavic roots. So if you've kind of got a good mastery of French and a good mastery of Russian, it's the language for you to progress onto next. So I'm very interested in what is the purpose of the writer, and one of the things that I feel very deeply, and I believe some philosophical theories can back this up, is that we don't really see with our eyes. We do see a bit with them, but mostly we see and we interpret and we read the world with the ideas that are in our heads. And what the writer can do is the writer can help a little bit the reader to see the world around him, to see London, to see Britain, or see even the tiniest little thing, by giving him new kind of insights and ideas. And one place where this struck me very acutely was if you wander around Buckingham Palace, you wander around Park Lane, you have these groups of Roma, also known as gypsies, perhaps in the old sort of slur word against them, who are living at night in the tunnels underneath Park Lane and underneath Hyde Park Corner. And I felt that this was a group of people that had been rendered invisible because they're not written about, they're not given the mic, so to speak, and I decided that I wanted to interview them, profile them, and as far as possible, live with them for a period in order to see what London looked like for them.
And what's remarkable about this is, as you write in your book, that here they are living this invisible life under the very place where the most expensive hotel in London is. The Gulf Arabs are floating in to have their butlers, the Duke of Wellington's house, and you just walk down a flight of stairs and you meet two incredible characters, the fiddler and the prince. These are kind of street philosophers, and I was particularly taken by the prince.
Oh.
So can you just read again, just a very short bit to get a sense of the way that the prince actually speaks?
I write what I can see. There are drunk women, confident and happy on the arms of men, who shout in the tunnel the way drunk people do, what they really think about these poor people, as their heels click and clack and they sway slightly. One glares at me, clutching her man, then hollers, "You may be a beggar, but you've still got a moleskin." Prince lets his eyes follow her wobbling arse. "They look good, but all these English girls are alcoholics. Just look at them. They drink like pigs. They drink until they can hardly walk. They disgust me. They are loose and wild. The villagers are almost all asleep."
And are you when you have your moleskin taking notes, are you also recording on your phone?
I was recording. It's all recorded on my phone.
And are you speaking to them in Romanian?
He and I was speaking to a mixture of Romanian and French. And
So tell us about. I was so fascinated.
these people are actually kind of great linguists. They're much better linguists than me. Like if you've developed a career involved in begging across Europe, you've got a very good mastery of particular French. They speak excellent German. You know, they're very impressive.
Because we've all walked by that group of people in the Hyde Park tunnels and seen them, and you know, one is a former lawyer. There is tell about the structure of how they live in the tunnels. They've recreated their Romanian villages.
Well, one of the sort of painful discoveries I made reporting on this phenomenon was these individuals are actually living in a state of modern slavery, and that they are debt slaves from Romanian villages who have been targeted by loan sharks where they come from. And because they're a sort of persecuted minority, one that we don't talk enough about in Europe, they're often not allowed access to the banking sector, or they're not allowed access to the local public services. And then when they run into debt, they need money, these loan sharks target them, and then when they can't pay back this debt at usurious rates, they trap them in the begging business and then ship them around Europe. So these people are not actually collecting the £1 or £2, if they're lucky, coins. All of it's being collected and given over to an enforcer at the end of the day. So the longer I spent in the tunnel, the more I realized that these people this is what was happening. And you had individuals that had previously had, you know, better careers or better lives that were being reduced to this, totally trapped, and in a situation where the British police don't understand what's going on, don't know what the phenomenon is, don't know how to help them, don't really know even how to deal with this kind of complicated crime going across different countries like this.
So just spend a moment on the fiddler.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the people that I met was, I called him the fiddler in the book, because I didn't want to put his name and surname in. He was he is a street musician that had come over from Romania. In a way, he was my sort of guide into this world of the street beggars. I think it's important to say all of these people are still doing what they're doing in the book. Right? I've seen him. I saw him subsequently. He lost his beautiful hat that he had when we first met, and he was still doing the same routine in London, trying to make ends meet.
So when the book came out, Was there any effort made by, I mean, because the book got so much attention and sold so amazingly here.
Thank you.
What was the reaction from the Roma community?
Well,
Did people go down to the Roma to see them, to try and meet them? Are there any?
like none is unfortunately the answer.
I find that a kind of a metaphor about how we don't see the other, even though the other is cinematically unrolled for us in this marvelous book.
So like the book has been translated into Polish and it sadly lost a literary prize in Poland recently, and it's been translated into Chinese, but it sadly hasn't been translated into Romanian, which I would love it to be.
So now let's cut to Peckham, which is this so intrigued me because I didn't know that Peckham was the kind of model city after the war where the poet John Betjeman lived. Can you tell us a little bit about the changing mores of Peckham, and then introduce us to the policeman?
Well, one of the profiles in the book is of a Nigerian-born policeman in Peckham, and I spent a lot of time with him trying to understand how he saw London, and his story kind of moved me about originally coming without quite the right papers, working a series of kind of kitchen jobs and hotel jobs to finally take on this position of authority as one of the most senior sort of policemen in that district. So something that people often tell me is they go, your book's full of stories of failure. Everyone in your book is a failure. And I actually get quite annoyed about this because with one or two exceptions, such as the first chapter, most of these people profiled in this book are huge successes on their own terms. Like if you've come with basically nothing to the UK and you end up as a very senior police officer, that's a high salary. You are a success. And judging the person a failure because they might not be a columnist in the Financial Times, I think is a bit silly. You know, so this is his voice. I loved putting on the uniform, that beautiful uniform, for the first time. Slowly it began to creep up on him in the faces along the shop fronts how much London had changed since 1989 when he arrived. He kept noticing the English, they were becoming more emotional. You could see it when they were driving. More and more of them would unfurl their windows, become all red-faced and start shouting and spittling. The streets were changing too. The Irish were disappearing, and so too were the little English shops. Those grubby units were more Kashmiri, Arabic and Turkish now, sometimes owned by people he could hardly even place. Cockney old London had shattered into 1,000 dazzling, inscrutable shards. This is not where I landed. The whole makeup, the whole thing, the whole of London changed. Back then, the hierarchy, it used to be the higher you go, the whiter you become. But the makeup is changing. The makeup is different now. The whites used to be English and Irish. Now there are many whites who are not English. The split is more immigrants and natives, and there are millions and millions of them flooding in.
Ben, so how did you decide where you were going to go? Because, I mean, it's just extraordinary to read in your contents page the amount of scenes you go into.
Oh.
You go, now do you say, I know it's spelled Peckham, and I've always said Peckham, but someone in the book says that the pronunciation is Pecknam. Is that not right?
Yeah, this gentleman is calling it Peckham, as in the violence of Peckham, Vietnam.
Oh, I see.
So,
Got it.
And he's describing like the with great joy actually the street violence that he actively participates in Peckham. So that's.
I thought this had become the common colloquial usage.
What?
Okay, no. Okay.
I would like it to become more common.
Okay, but
it's a part of London I'm very fond of.
All right, so you go to Neasden Lane, you go to Peshawar, London, you go to Elephant and Castle, you're at Hammersmith, White City, North Circular, Beckton Alps, Berkeley Square. So, I mean, it's and then you wind up in Belgravia, yes, with the and more. Knightsbridge, Catford Bridge, 4th Street, so many, Harlesden Road, Chester Road, Rye Lane, Lambert Road. I mean, all of these extraordinary cinematic scenes. I mean, I felt like I was watching the movie Traffic.
Oh, thank you. Well,
So let's.
I was doing something right.
So now, just to pull back a touch, you write this sort of completely oblivious to the coming Brexit tsunami.
Yeah.
But weirdly, you become this kind of strange bard of this moment. So,
Well, it's sort of weird. Like, as I wrote this book some time ago, a few years ago now, and I don't really know when I began writing it. I think, in a way, I began writing it at school when I liked to sort of collect these stories from London and tell them to my friends. They found it funny, and maybe it began around then. When I wrote this, I was doing nothing else. There wasn't really very much else in my life at that time, and I did it in a sort of emotional, like, kind of fugue almost, in which I took extraordinarily little interest in British politics, any kind of politics, and I was determined. I'm a natural mimic. I think that if you grow up between different languages, you have to be, and you know, I'm a good kind of imitator, I'm a good forger. I would have been very good at a life of crime, I think. And I was so worried about basically just copying other people that I decided in this 2.5-year period I wrote this, I wasn't going to watch a movie about London, I wasn't going to read a book about London, I wasn't going to do any of that, and somehow in this, I gave myself the excuse not to read anything about Tory politics. So when the book came out in January before the referendum. I do not think the concept, I remember around then, I actually thought that the word Brexit was pronounced Brit-exit. So I don't think I was very aware of it, but maybe that does make it sort of a portrait of the era.
I mean, you would have been a remarkable thief, because one of the things that you had to do to penetrate these worlds was to imitate thieves. I mean, at one point, you imitated a Russian immigrant and went into, was it the Doss House?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I wanted this book to have like many. You know, I wanted it to feel like I wanted it to be a good read, and like, in order to be a good read, I wanted it to have different styles. Like, most of the stories in the book are, you know, pretty simple. Like, I meet somebody, they tell me their story, I give you that story with all of my power that I can. But then sometimes there are stories about London that cannot be, that I couldn't just do that. I couldn't just turn up and, you know, shake somebody's hand, sit down, put the recorder on and go. And one of these stories that I became obsessed about, and at the time I kept on doubting myself, is this really such an important issue? I became obsessed about overcrowding. And only now do I realise, not only was I writing in the shadow of Brexit, in which I took no interest, I was also writing, in a way, in the shadow of Grenfell Tower. And in order to get into these flats, these sort of doss houses, as they're known, where you have multiple people sleeping to a bed, you have these illegal, you know, places where you've got sometimes 20, 30 people packed into a flat. I couldn't just turn up and be, hello, my name's Ben Judah, I'm running a book for Picador Press, I'd love your story to be part of it. I had to pose as a client, so to speak. So in order to access this, I spent a lot of time talking to policemen, trying to work out how do you do this undercover business. And one of the techniques that I was told is a very good way to do it is you go in as the second. Somebody else goes in before you, for you. In this case, a friend of mine who's a Romanian police translator, and you go along as sort of like the mate. And if you're doing this for the police, you go into all the recording devices around you. You're the strong silent type. You just sort of grunt or sort of say a few words. And this is how we integrated into this doss house in East London, where we lived for a bit as penniless Romanian migrants.
Was it the Doss House where they began threatening you and asked you if you were Jewish? And where
It was actually not a Romanian. It was actually not an immigrant who did that. It was a white British person who got very upset about.
Yeah, what was the story? What was the provocation?
I remember if I remember correctly, there was no provocation. Is that we had gone to like a Chinese restaurant in order to have a beer, and we were sort of discussing things, and this individual who perhaps had been, I don't know, enjoying his Breitbart a bit too much, I'm not sure, lashed out at us with some curse words.
And you were speaking Russian or no? You were speaking, or did he hear your posh English accent? What did he hear?
I'm sure he did. But I was with this friend of mine who's a Romanian police translator, and I'm not entirely sure if he thought both of us were Jewish, or it was like the Romanian look and my look that just tipped him over the edge. I'm not sure, but that was an anti-Semitic incident.
Did you feel in any danger at that moment?
No, I don't. Like, anti-Semitism is one of my least favourite topics to talk about, but no. In the list of anti-Semitic incidents I've experienced, that was a mild, a spot of light rain.
But there were moments in the book where you did feel in some danger, or you were a little bit worried, where people were a bit threatening. Can you tell us about that? We were trying to
work out. One moment it was a bit threatening, actually, is we were trying to work out how the sort of street worker economy of Ilford Lane worked. We became very obsessive about this, like going up and down, and we were actually followed at some times by local sort of heavies, and that was from actually a Romanian gang that was operating there. So yes, I felt a bit worried. I think it's important to say that I don't think this book is brave. I don't think it's dangerous. You know, the reporters that do brave and dangerous stuff are the ones who are out there in Syria, or the people who are like trying to take down Putin's finances. I think people often ask me if it was brave because of the kind of horror of poverty on the doorstep, which I think alarms us more than the glamour of chasing such situations abroad.
So before we go to questions, I want, Ben, if you would take us into the world of the caretakers. I was very moved by your man, Femi. Set the scene, and then I'm going to have you read a paragraph or two.
So, I really wanted to write about one of the ideas I had in writing this book was everybody in this book whose portrait is done has come from abroad. There's nobody who's born in the UK who's profiled. And I wanted to use this to kind of reveal by sonar who the old Londoners, who the English, if you want, really are. Another idea I had in doing this is I'm a slightly schizophrenic personality, hopefully not too schizophrenic, and a lot of my day job is working as a think tank analyst, and so I love statistics and numbers and surveys, and I was struck by just how many carers there are in London, how many zero-contract hospital workers, how many cleaners there are, and that those stories I felt were underwritten. So I spent a considerable amount of time, and what you don't see in the book is all the failed attempts. Probably, I want to say 9 out of 10, but it felt at the time like 95 out of 100 attempts to get stories and organise interviews and write chapters failed. But this one succeeded, and I profiled these two carers who were dealing with people with dementia and dealing people in their last stages of life in hospitals, who were both from Nigeria, actually.
So set the scene with the hospital, of where the hospital
is. So this gentleman is called Femi, and we spent a long afternoon of him telling me about what it's like to work as a hospital carer, dealing for the very sick and for the dying. Femi notices everything. There was one evening where he was passing through the hospital bays with the wheels clicking on the feeding trolley where he saw an old Jamaican guy. He was almost passed out and his family were there around him going, "We love you, Grandpa." They had brought him what looked like a medal and put it on his plastic bedside. Femi moved closer, asking the daughters, "Would you like some tea?" and saw the medal was a little bronze cross with the face of 2 kings on it. "What's that?" he asked the old man. He was almost gone. He was breathing very softly and his eyes were closed, but he whispered, "That's an OBE. It was given to me by the Queen." I looked at him, this old Jamaican guy, looking so bad, I thought, said Femi, and I thought, he has met the Queen? So I went to him, "Sir, why did she give it to you? What's the story?" And the old Jamaican man, he shivered and went, "Son, maybe I'll tell you some other time." And he was sleeping. The daughters, they told me he had done such great works, but not what they were. And then I went to do some feeding further down the bay. But what got me was that in this country, this old black guy can meet the Queen. And I thought, okay, this guy did it, I can make it too.
And that is this sort of the story that is getting lost at this political moment of the immigrant experience.
Oh, well, thank you. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much for structuring it like that, because often I find when I do these events, people want me to talk about Brexit and the second referendum and the...
We want you to do
Yeah.
that too, but
no.
we're going to...
But sort of,
So-
and I feel that these voices are sort of lost in these...
And is it really true that you worked as a Polish contract? You worked.
I
in
worked on this
construction.
building. I worked on
Yeah.
this building site. Yes.
Yeah, so tell us about this marvelous man who had sort of made a success, and he's the one who said that the Russians are now the Zone 1 buyers. Yeah, what is that analysis?
So one
I
of
love
the... This was actually one of the very, very first things that piece of reporting I did. And, you know, one of the people I profiled is a sort of Polish building king. And I went to work for his company and joined his company and basically traveled around Zone 1 London with him through his eyes, like looking at how he was building the city and transforming the city. And this was a guy who had left Poland to escape Soviet-imposed martial law in the 1980s, and now found himself wishing he had kept up his Russian in order to service their political descendants, who were the Ukrainian and Russian oligarch class buying properties in sort of Kensington and Westminster and whatnot. So that was one of the profiles that I did.
And his early construction workers were the sort of the former artisans and sculptors, and they were just hopeless doing construction. Tell
Yeah.
about that.
Well,
I love that detail.
Well, one of the stories he told me was that when the great immigration from Poland began, you know, the first wave of workers he had on his building site were the real Polish intelligentsia. There would be sort of painters from the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts, like, touching up the bathroom. There would be political philosophy being talked around as the loft conversions were done, and that had faded away, and that today it was really the villages
Yeah.
that were here, and that he was saying that a lot of the Polish immigration to the UK gives a false impression of Poland as the people coming are people from some of the most deprived and backward villages who would struggle to find work in Warsaw that are coming to London.
And is this that he is sort of heartsick because he sees the beauty of the London architecture is being completely demolished, yes, by his clients who are doing these renovations. Tell about this.
He's outraged.
Yeah.
And he'll talk about this at length. He told me with like great sadness that he felt that his job was to destroy London, and that he comes into all of these beautiful Victorian houses. He comes in, there's this amazing like taps and bathroom work made from the 19th century. These beautiful kitchens. And the new clients come in and they're just like white tops, marble, everything out. And he feels this great sense of sadness at what he does, of just like ripping out this wallpaper of everything white. And if I remember correctly, he had in the back of his truck some of these like particular pieces of sort of vintage stuff that he was finding.
So what let's just, before we go to questions, let's go right now to Belgravia and the Filipina housemaid circuit, and what possibly Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt and Jeremy Corbyn could learn if they hung around with your Filipinas.
Yeah. Oh, well, so this was one of the pieces of reporting that gave me a great happiness, actually, is one of the chapters is a kind of collective profile of these maids from the Philippines who are working in Knightsbridge and in Belgravia, and about their lives and what they see and what they do and their experiences. And there were some things that I didn't realise that really kind of moved me. Like, one was them showing me on their phones all of their lost children, all these children they'd cared for a year or two, then they'd been bumped on, moved on, and how the cord was snapped. One was listening to their kind of categorization of the people that they sort of worked for, and how difficult it was to work for French and the other kinds of French, such as Italians or Spanish. Their particular attitudes towards cleaning, how in a way easy it was to work for Russians because they paid no attention to whether things were clean or not. And them talking about how difficult it was to work for some of the Gulf super rich that often take away their passports and try and imprison them, and these different techniques that were used in order to escape from their clutches, such as putting their clothes in bin bags and sort of coming out of the door saying they were going to put the bins out and then just sort of fleeing to find other communities of people from the Philippines that could take them in.
It's extraordinary, and it is truly a love story to London, because now there's 40% of London is foreign-born, or is it 55%? What's the statistic now?
So the statistics, well, it depends how much weight you want to give these statistics. Yes. So the statistic that's from a few years ago now is that 37% of people who live in London are born abroad. So they could have been people like my late sort of grandparents that have been living in London since the 1950s when they arrived from India, and they would have probably been a bit troubled if you put them in the same category as somebody arrived yesterday from the Philippines or from Poland. So that's that wide category of people who are born abroad. It doesn't tell us much apart from that. And then there's a statistic of 55% people who live in the City of London who do not click in the census or tick or put a pen, I'm not sure what they're all doing, who are white British by ethnicity. So I wouldn't put that I'm white British by ethnicity. I put I am white other, because I think, and that, does that mean that London's not an English city anymore? Does it mean that what does it mean, such as this recent sort of controversy of stupid over John Cleese tweeting? I think it means that London's not an exclusively English city anymore, in the way it was in the 1930s or in the 1950s. It's still an English city, but it's like an English city plus. And something that really so moved me is the moment where this population truly feels that they have become English. Oh, well, this is interesting. This is something I did talk about with my grandparents, which is, I found it very interesting talking, profiling these different people. And a big question I had, and which almost sunk the book, actually, was how on earth do I organise all these stories? I don't want to just, I wanted the book to have some of the sense of chaos of being in the city. You turn a corner and then another corner and then another corner. It's completely different. But, that would have been a very frustrating reading experience. And then slowly I began to realise that the anthropological, the economic, was not what was holding these stories together. And in fact, stories of people of whatever background, from youth, from middle age, from old age, had more in common with each other. So the book is actually arranged on the arc of life. Immigration a bit like birth, arrival, and then going all the way to where our friend Femi was just there, like where the story ends in death. And one of the key moments for me was trying to work out, when did people feel that they had become British? And almost all of the interviewees, regardless of whether it was Belgravia or Ilford, said that they began to really feel British through their children. And only when their children were at school, coming back, talking about British things, they have to learn what these British things were, and that made them feel British through their children. A very interesting division I noticed especially with between men and women, was quite pronounced. And with the Eastern European migration, women were doing a lot better, and actually being a lot more successful and feeling British a lot quicker, so to speak. And that's because women from Eastern Europe were often put in these customer-facing roles, Costa Coffee or cleaners, and were paid more than sort of bricklayers or sort of bricklayers or other kind of builders, who paid much less, and who typically would only work with other men from Eastern Europe. So a dynamic I often observed was that a lot of these men from Eastern Europe thought they were going home, and their girlfriends and wives were sort of thinking differently. And they'd decided to think differently because they had established a lot of weak and strong ties to British women or other people, often through cleaning, that would tell them it's much better to have a baby here and to be a woman here. So that was an interesting little.
So it's the story of families, and it's a triumph. And Ben will be signing books after the session. But Ben, amazing reporting, amazing.
Thank you.
You are a camera eye, and I just cannot say enough wonderful things about your book. Who has a question for Ben Judah?
Oh, please.
Well, first of all, I confess that I haven't read your book.
Oh, well,
But now that I've heard of what has been written there, I'm intrigued to read it. And I should buy it and read it. I have a question for you. You have a clear idea about immigration from India because your grandparents immigrated from India. And then, according to my limited knowledge, there are some mega rich Indians in London.
Yes.
And there is a lot of immigration going on even now.
Yes.
Did it not occur to you to sort of explore that avenue?
So I wanted to write, one of the things that the book is heavier on the new immigration that's happening in my lifetime, and where it's not really been written about a lot. And the immigration that began in the 50s and in the 30s, I sort of left out, though there is some of it in there, because, those novels have been written, those stories have been sort of out there. So I made a decision to leave out not leave out, but just not kind of concentrate on the South Asian and on the sort of Caribbean stories. But as you heard from that little anecdote, they're definitely in there. There are like a few South Asian characters in the book. One that I actually ended the book on, and that for me was a way of sort of ordering the sense of time elapsed through immigration, was this Pakistani gentleman who works in a mosque in East London, and whose job is to wash the bodies before burial. He's also a taxi driver, so he has quite a taxing professional life. And that was a very, very moving interview for me, and I found that by complete chance. I sort of came into I sort of phoned him up, I went to the mosque, and he actually thought I had a body, and when it was revealed that I did not, he walked me through what he did, and I was very, very moved by his description of how he prepares the bodies, he sings to them, takes them on their journey. It was that's one South Asian story, and he told me about especially how East London had changed since he arrived.
And we have questions. Go ahead.
Just one more question. So, I can try and just speak louder. So thank you for a really interesting talk and a really interesting book. I just had one question. So we talked a little bit about this new and old immigration, and I was just wondering, kind of, what do you see as some of the differences between that and maybe with the integration? Is it kind of the globalization, the context, different politics, different circumstances? Or I know that's not necessarily something you're trying to set out to do, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I do actually. And so one thing that really struck me actually, and this just came up a lot from especially people from Eastern Europe, was they feel that they're treated differently, or they have a different access to the system because they were never colonized and they were never part of the British Empire system. And so I heard a lot from them that migrants from South Asia or the Caribbean or even sort of Nigeria had over many generations like champions within the state, and they don't. And they felt that, and I think this is sort of borne out if you look at the history, that you had, very esteemed members of the House of Commons from South Asian immigrant background, like from, I can't remember the date unfortunately, but it's definitely before the First World War. Not the case for immigrants from Eastern Europe of this particular background. And I was told again and again by them that they felt that, well, they just sort of sensed that the multicultural myth or legend was very much an outgrowth of some kind of British Empire story that they felt excluded from, and that they felt that they were sort of, maybe without people realising that they were treated a bit differently. And I was like really stunned by how often that came up. And so in terms of like one point, it's maybe useful in drawing that distinction, the long duration of South Asian and Caribbean migration and those imperial links means that there's just a lot of people within the body of the state, and with Romanians and Poles from the new migration, even in an area where, even in these areas in the book, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single councillor of that background or very attuned to that those concerns. And I think that if that's something that that's something that the Mayor of London or any of the political parties, if they so choose, could do something to kind of remedy, just like trying to promote more people in.
Do we have time for more questions? Yes.
So, when you emerged after your 2.5 years writing the book with your head down and the telly off, quite apart from what was going on outside when you put the telly back on, how had your relationship to the London you inhabit changed, or had it changed? Did you see London differently and feel it differently?
Yes. Well, it kind of made me realise that I didn't really. It made me very distrustful of like my impression of London before, and before I wrote this, I thought, oh, I know London, I live in London, in the way that if I lived in a small village and I knew every street of it, I would be able to say. But actually, I'd not even been to 85% of it. Like, if I was going to do a list of boroughs before I did this book, I'd maybe been to like 5 of them. And one part of the process of doing this was that I spent months like really just walking everywhere, just going everywhere. I wanted to see everything just before I even began. I was just consumed by this, perhaps not entirely relevant to the writing process, project of that. And when I came out of it, I felt, well, what was the London in my head? And it made me kind of alarmed that the London in my head, I think, was basically very heavily composed of like trash from TV and the Evening Standard like property supplement and
and the Royals,
EastEnders
and the Royals.
And
you wrote about the Royals,
like
sort of white London, just kind of white London.
Yeah, or just like these concerns that you find in the Guardian, and like sort of so yes, it made me kind of a bit freaked out really about how the distinction between the idea of place in your mind and where you're actually living. So, yeah. So, well, thank you. I hope that answers the question.
Here's another.
Here I am. What's the future of London? Can you make a guess of, based on what you have, the experience, what you have read, with all the people you have met, and the current situation? What do you think it would be?
Like something that first the positives, and something that I've been writing and living actually in other cities recently. I spent a lot of time in New York and Paris and actually Rotterdam, a very interesting city in the Netherlands. And one area where London I think really stands out is there's like a lot of intermarriage, inter-ethnic relationships feel much easier here than they do anywhere I've been in in continental Europe, and yes, the United States. So that, I think, is a very positive trend. And if you look at the demography, we've got a pretty good guess of what the population will look like in 2050, 2060, because we know what the 5-year-olds look like. And ethnicity and race are going to get a hell of a lot blurrier. That instead of it being just the odd person out that says, well, I've got, like me, I've got German Jewish heritage and I've got Indian Jewish heritage and it's all like this and actually I do this, that's going to be totally the norm by mid-century. That's the positive story. The negative story is I can't tell you whether there's going to be no deal Brexit or not, or whether or not there's going to be any of those big big systemic shocks to the economy of London, to the sort of frontiers of the UK, and that observing European politics, one of the things that I've come away from recently over the last few years thinking is economics are a lot less determinative than one would have thought. Is that if the economics were going to determine the future relationship between the UK and the EU would have given a much more generous deal to the UK. But no, the EU's got its own politics. It needs to hold together. They need to keep these sort of populist parties at bay. And now, the flip side, the EU's looking at the UK, thinking, well, they're going to have to avoid no deal because the economics say one should avoid no deal. But what if the politics are too tight for that to take place? That's something I'm very worried about. I think will have a big impact on the future of London. Can't say how though.
Do we have time for one more?
We still have 8 minutes, so maybe.
So if I could jump in just with a moderator's prerogative. I've recently been, to this larger conversation, I've recently been reading a lot of editorials that were written in the New York Times and the New York papers at the turn of the century, 1900. And inevitably, the theme of all these editorials is New York can't survive the infusion of these filthy people that are coming from Eastern Europe. Our city is over. The future of America is very dismal. We have to stop the migration. And these are written 1905, 1900, 1960. And so we all know what happened. This world became the most vibrant world. They built industry, they built commerce, and this is the sign of immigrant experience. Can you reflect on this as it just pertained to your reporting and sort of your larger, what you now take away from it?
Well, I thought a lot about the history of New York when I was writing this book, and I thought a lot about that period that you've been writing about. So I'd love to actually learn more about that after the event. But I do think that London now is a little bit, not too much, but a little bit like New York in the pre-1930s moment, back when the Jews were still speaking Yiddish, the Italians were still speaking 15 different Italian languages, the Irish were still, a lot of them still speaking Gaelic, and it was only 1 or 2 generations in that everything clicked and that you had that New York culture that came out of it. So I do feel, in a way, that London is a culture about to happen, or a culture that's happening amongst people who are younger than me, like my brother's age or my sister's age, and that there will be something exciting, cool, like that totally unexpected, weird fusion of like Italian and Jewish and Irish culture that erupted out of New York in the 50s and 60s. So I think I'm very optimistic actually about the culture that can come out of London, even if I'm, as I just said, a bit confused about the economics. One perhaps like more dour point is, and here I don't know, I've listened to a lot of debates about this and I can't make up my mind. There is an argument which is taking place amongst people who like to think about immigration in historical terms, that there's a level of immigration before which triggers a backlash in society, and there are scholars in the US that like to draw attention to the fact that the percentage of the population which is foreign-born in the US, when you had this last great anti-immigrant backlash, around the 1910s and 1920s, is a similar rate than it is now, like around 15 to 20%. And it actually fell back down in the middle of the 20th century, following these closed border policies to around sort of between 5 and 10%. Other scholars on the other side say that both those periods are marked by the Great Depression or the Great Recession, so one shouldn't. So it's either dynamic or one shouldn't blame the immigration rate in society. But yeah, those are conversations that I'm following with interest.
And as you go into this mad election period now, Ben is moving to New York. I'm pleased to say that we're getting him in our city. But if you were going to give one last word to the various competing prime ministers, what would it be? What scenes would you have them go visit that could illuminate their policies?
So, now I've got like pretty. I've got, when I was, right the way through from when this book was published, my policy recommendations have been pretty minimal but I think could be important. One is we have minimum wage in this society, but it is not enforced. Like minimum wage needs to be enforced. Right. Otherwise, minimum wage becomes something that only people who sort of people who are very established in the country can demand or ask for. And I was shocked by viewing how a significant chunk of the London economy is a non-minimum wage economy. People are often being paid in chicken and chips in order to perform basic building tasks. So my first policy recommendation is minimum wage needs to be enforced, and that we need inspectors to do that. My second policy recommendation would be, I was deeply alarmed, and after Grenfell remain even more alarmed, about this issue of overcrowding which is taking place right across London. And again, it's not a fashionable policy recommendation, it's not going to change the world, it's not building a new economy, but we need housing inspectors. And that the cut to the housing inspectorate that took place under the Cameron/Osborne government has had really negative effects. So you need people to come around every now and again, or just make people think that they're coming around to check that overcrowding isn't taking place. And one policy recommendation, which I'm going to repeat until I go blue in the face, because indeed Nigel Farage said points-based Australian-style immigration system for 30 years until people were suddenly like, huh, what points-based? Would be, we need the Mayor of London and the UK government doesn't know how to reach a lot of this new immigration from Eastern Europe, doesn't know how to communicate messages to them. And they're not organised via churches really, or mosques, where a lot of communication can take place quite easily to other communities. They don't have these existing structures or elites tied into the British system. And when you go on these web portals in Polish or Romanian, you have clear as day that people don't know their rights. People going, I got injured at work, I don't know what to do, I've not been paid, I'm pregnant in the UK, what am I supposed to do? I'm ripped off, I'm living with 20 people in a doss house. And the UK government needs to communicate what your rights are, what minimum wage is, who to call, and have more point people and more services available in Polish and Romanian. So.
Anyone else? Final moment. Ben, thank you. Oh, one more.
Thank you, sir.
What do you think of the relationship between London and the rest of England? How do you see that playing out?
That's the story of Britain. Yeah, really interesting. I'll tell you something that's like fresh on my mind. Actually, is I went to Grantham. Actually, in the referendum in 2016. I'll tell you why I've been thinking about it. I went to Margaret Thatcher's from Grantham. It's this town in Lincolnshire, and I went there to write about Tory members, Tory councillors, and what they were thinking about, the world, what they were thinking about the referendum. And as I sort of, one of the things I was really struck by in this town is people there are not just. You hear a lot of anti-immigrant feeling against the polls that have come, and people lash out against that, and a lot of these local Conservative Party activists were talking about that. But then once you get to know them, you realise that the bigger pain is the people who have left. And that when Margaret Thatcher was growing up, this town had a whole mini sociology. It had a local aristocrat who lived there, occasionally came to London. There was a local managerial class running these factories, a very well paid, upper middle class jobs in the regions. Her father's grocer shop was really the prime grocer shop. It was more like the local Fortnum, selling goods actually from India, where to the local sort of upper class. And since over the last 2 generations, the sociology of the town is basically totally flattened, in which all of the comparative jobs are now located in London. All of the young people are now sucked out if they've graduated and go to London. So the town has this flat sociology of immigrants working low-paid jobs, people who can't leave or maybe disabled or maybe have children or some problems, and then this like rich retiree class and nothing in between. And that, I think, is the relationship between London and the rest of the country, which is how, and it's not really got anything to do with the immigrant London of the book, but how London is hollowing out these small towns and what can be done about that. So I spent a lot of time with these local conservative activists, and they would talk a lot about how the town isn't the town anymore. Immigration was the thing they latched onto, but when you got to know them, they would say it wasn't because their children lived in London. So that's something I'm thinking about, and I don't know, I hope it answers a little bit of the question.
Ben will be in the bookstore signing books. We're going to sell out all the books today.
Oh, thank you.
On his way to New York.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.